As a continuation of our building a macroeconomic model of how the economy works, we're going to pick up the aggregate expenditures model that we discussed in the last video, and noting that there are different levels of GDP that are as a result of different changes in aggregate expenditure. The aggregate expenditures, you might remember, are simply this, taking it from the expenditures approach to GDP, consumption plus investment, plus government spending, plus, and I should say plus or minus, net exports. And as a result of this, what do we have here? We have different levels of spending, and that I'm going to call it the aggregate expenditures 1, 2, and 3, that correspond then to different changes in equilibrium GDP at these particular levels. Now, one thing that we discussed in the last video was some of the shortcomings of the aggregate expenditures model, and among those was the fact that supply was not really well represented. There are some other shortcomings that are discussed as well, and we'll come to in later segments of the course. But for right now, this main issue is what do we do with the demand side model only, one that only focuses on the demand side of the macroeconomy. Well, to do this, we have to have some useful model whereby we bring a supply in, and so that's what we'll try to do here. But first, before we get to supply, let's talk about demand, in particular the macro variable aggregate demand. This looks a lot like the demand curve for any particular market, as discussed in earlier chapters in your book, that were really the introductory chapters talking about demand being a downward sloping function. Indeed, aggregate demand, that is demand for all goods and services in a particular economy, including imports, are also downward sloping. And unlike the microeconomic model where the price of the good is represented on the vertical axis and the quantity of the good is represented, here we're talking about the price level. The price level. This is a macro variable that simply tracks the rate of changes in the price level, the inflation rate throughout the economy. And so it would be based on some kind of index like the consumer price index or the implicit price deflator, and it represents different price levels through the economy. And one thing we can note is this: these different levels of expenditure and levels of GDP also correspond to this aggregate demand curve. And aggregate demand is downward sloping due to things like this change in the price level, meaning that if the price level falls, it means consumers have, well, all buyers, I should say, have more purchasing power and could demand more output, and demanding output creates a higher level of income and output, or GDP. If the price level goes up, on the other hand, this falls in the other direction. So as a result, we have a downward sloping aggregate demand curve that really represents the demand for all goods and services throughout the economy. And if we were to put this together then with its counterpart, the supply curve, the aggregate supply curve, which is an upward sloping curve, we note that we have a model that looks very similar to the model of demand and supply as presented in the original equilibrium model in the introductory chapters, chapter 3. As a result of this, what do we have when we have these two coming together? Well, we have an equilibrium point. It's the equilibrium that we discussed earlier, and that's simply a point at which aggregate demand for goods is equivalent to aggregate supply for goods. And here's one thing that is a little bit different, however, and that is the idea that aggregate supply, as being an upward sloping curve, is a little bit different. We say this is a short run configuration. And in subsequent videos, I'll talk more about what is the progression from the short run to the long run. But here's what's going on. Why is it upward sloping? Beyond the general idea of the law of supply that was discussed much earlier is the idea of what do suppliers in general respond to, and that is if there's a higher price level, then suppliers are able to provide more output and are willing to do so. A lower price level, they're willing to supply less output. But here's the other thing too. It is believed that output, which is simply another term for GDP, output equals income equals GDP or Y, output is something that can be changed much faster than the price of inputs. And so as a result of this, if the price level is rising for goods, then suppliers are incentivized to produce more output because of the fact that wages, that oftentimes a very major input cost, don't catch up with rising prices. If the price of the good that your firm is working for is rising, how easy is it for you as a worker to get a wage increase? Not very easy, not very quickly. So in the short run, which is, we'll leave mostly undefined for right now, in the short run, there's an incentive for producers to produce more output as the price level rises, and a disincentive as the price level falls. And in subsequent videos, we'll talk about what the progression is between this, the aggregate supply curve in the short run, and the aggregate supply curve in the long run. And just for illustrative purposes right now, we'll simply say that in the long run, there's the relationship between the price level and GDP is this. and that is aggregate supply is not influenced by the price level in the long run. That's something that we'll get to in subsequent videos as we make this progression from the short run to the long run. For right now, though, what we're doing is sort of making the leap from the original macroeconomic model of demand through expenditures to aggregate demand, and now to a more general equilibrium model of the macroeconomy.